Welcome to Changing the Subject, Boards as Social Movement Spaces. My name is Jean Bell. I curate this leading edge membership program for Nonprofit Quarterly. We're so glad that you're here today for this conversation. There's been a lot of interest in it leading up to it. I know the board space is a canvas for rethinking, right, for reimagining, and these guests are really excited to explore that with you today. I want to share with you before we get into it, the logistics for the session. So like all of our sessions, which run about monthly, this is a 90-minute session. We do record and provide you with that recording in a few days. It will come with the slides. We use the Q&A box because that's more interactive. You can put comments, questions, you can upvote each other's questions, you can comment back to each other's questions. So we find that's the most lively place. Our speakers have set aside some time at the end for me to moderate questions to all three of our guests, but feel free to write them in as you think of them, and we'll be collecting them and make sure to pose as many as we can. We hope you're following Nonprofit Quarterly on Twitter. We have a really active feed there. We always evaluate the sessions, and we use your feedback not only to share with the guests who put a lot of time into preparing for today, but to think about what future sessions you might be seeking. So please just hold on for 3 minutes. It's only a couple questions, and provide that feedback. And as I mentioned, this session is part of a larger program at MPQ called the Leading Edge Membership, where really active users get a digital subscription to our beautiful magazine edited by Cindy Suarez, to access to these monthly learning sessions, as well as the whole archive of them. So if you haven't checked that out, it's in the upper right-hand corner of our website. It's called Leading Edge Membership. And I have on the screen here what we've got in development for the fall. In September, we're going to do a session on going virtual. So many of us are now virtual or quasi-virtual. What does that mean for staff connection, for equity, for good management? So we're going to have a session on going virtual. Then we're going to return to the issue of executive transition, which we can't get away from, and keep exploring new practices that match our current understanding of leadership for executive transition. And then in November, we're going to look at the disability justice movement writ large, how it ought to be affecting our work writ large, as well as our workplaces. So that's the kind of stuff we're exploring in the Leading Edge Membership Program, and hope you'll join us. I'm glad you're here today. I want to thank Shamika, who you see on your screen, for providing ASL interpretation today. Her colleague Jared is also here, so we're going to benefit from their expertise. Thank you for being here. Hi, Jared. Thank you. All right, let's do some introductions, and I'm going to start with Makiyah Moody of Kairos. Thank you for being here.
Great, thank you, and greetings to everyone from the unceded lands of the Wabanaki and the Pennacook in Nashua, New Hampshire. I'm Makiyah Moody, president and founder of Kairos and Heart LLC, a small consultancy. I am currently a board member at Heartland Alliance in Chicago, which is a global human rights organization, and a founding board member with the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity. I am thrilled to be in conversation with my co-panelists today.
Wonderful. Jenifer Holland.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the founder of JLG Consulting. I'm also a dog mom, a swimmer, an aspiring dancer, and I do my work in the entire DMV area, living in Maryland, coming to you from Virginia today.
All right, and Dr. Carmen Rojas is here from the Marguerite Casey Foundation as well, but we're going to get more into your introduction and your story a little bit later, so thank you for being here. And Anya, if you could bring up the poll, let's find out who's in the room, the virtual room. So poll 1 about roles. So we know that you bring multiple roles into the space, so this is multiple choice. Which of these are active for you? Are you an executive director or CEO? Are you staff, but not in that executive role? A board member? Are you a consultant, capacity builder? Are you a funder? Or are there other current roles that are in mind today as you enter this conversation? Let's see what the answers are there. I think, there we go. Oh, it's a real mix of folks who are interested in this conversation about boards as social movement spaces, about a third executives, good deal of staff, lots of people who play a board role, lots of people who play a coach or consultant role, some funders, and other interesting roles, I'm sure. So that gives us a sense of everything we're bringing into the room. And I also wanted to ask a second question, both in service of you as a participant, just to ground yourself, and also for our panelists, which is just, to what extent is or are the boards that you're representing as you come into this conversation pursuing evolution in board purpose and mindset, for lack of a better term, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Are you not at all there? Are they not at all there? Are you in early exploration, active exploration, or maybe you've already been practicing kind of a new frame, new mindsets for the board space? So we'll give you a second to answer that. This one is only choose one. So, also a really interesting distribution. So we have some folks who are very nascent, and we have some folks who are already practicing, and a lot of people identifying as kind of in between in terms of exploring new ways of thinking about boards. Thank you, Anya, for those polls, and I hope they're a helpful setup to you, Makiyah and Jenifer, as you kick us off.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Jean. So as Jenifer and I planned for this conversation and went through our ideation and thought process, we really turned to wonder. And so this conversation is an invitation for you to consider what's possible. One of the places that we started thinking about what's possible for boards is from the lessons of social movements and how and whether some of those lessons can be relevant for boardrooms and board spaces. As you know, the civil rights movement, marriage equality movement, like these social movements have been able to mobilize people for social change that has impacted the collective good. And so since the board's role and function is to help steer the ship that is the organization, we were wondering to what extent should that steering and that strategic direction be informed by and directed by those that are most impacted by the organization's work. We had plenty of questions. There was a little bit of arm wrestling to think about what was most significant or not significant for this conversation. And so we are overjoyed that Carmen Rojas is able to join us and provide her wisdom and perspective, given her role at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, as well as all of the other experiences that she's had in the social sector and life as it relates to this conversation. So we are going to begin with some context setting about existing governance frameworks, lift up some of Manuel Pastor's work related to social movements that we see as promising, and then really get into a deep discussion with Carmen related to kind of like what's emerging for her from this conversation and what her experiences have been with the various boards that she's worked with. As I said, this conversation is about practicing possibility in the realm of board governance. And there's a clear recognition for us that boards are not monolithic. So what a college board requires, I'm a former trustee at Wheaton College, what that boardroom required of me is very different than, not very different, but there are nuances and distinctions between what my grassroots community organization might need in Southern New Hampshire compared to, a multi-million-dollar endowment that needs to be managed at an institution of higher education. And so all of that to say, this is your spoiler alert, that as three different people with distinct experiences and proximity, knowledge of social movements, experiences in the boardroom or in organizations, we may not agree on everything that we are going to chew on and lift up and kick the tires on. And so we are excited about the principled debate that is going to ensue as we think about shifting from power over to power with, and whether that's significant and helpful in the context of boardrooms, as well as this notion of Ubuntu. So thinking about shared humanity. How is it that your humanity is manifest and demonstrated when you are sitting around the board table? And if more mutuality and self-awareness is something that can be a lubricant for better boards as they try to advance the strategic direction of their organizations. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jenifer, who's going to provide some additional context setting.
Great. Thank you so much, Makiyah. And hearing those words as we get into this discussion and dialogue together make my heart skip a beat. I feel honored, elated, nerve-sighted, as a friend of mine's child would say, nervous and excited to be with both you and Dr. Carmen Rojas and all of the participants that are on today's webinar to explore this big canvas, to explore this big space together. And my commitment to my fellow panelists and also our participants and those that listen later or listen back on audio is to be precise wherever I can. And I invite my fellow panelists to give me opportunities and additional wisdom and vision if I haven't defined my terms, because there is a lot here. There is a lot here. So just to dig into our slides, I would just offer that this is, as you heard, an aspirational conversation that really invites you to reconsider the way the board does its work. And so it was really fascinating to see what proportion of participants on today's webinar are not only in early or midpoint conversations, but some that would even characterize their conversations as advanced or seasoned, or spent a good deal of time thinking about the mindsets by which the board does its work. And so this very simple diagram to show the pace of change over time is meant to give us a way to locate ourselves in this conversation, a way to name that when Makiyah and I had thought and wrestled, as she said, and ideated around today's conversations, we really were thinking 11 plus years out. Possibly some of the things are further. And I won't pin us to 11 years, but in that larger ideation, that larger dream space. So already flowing through on my first commitment to be precise and help us locate ourselves in the conversation and precise with definitions. Much of the thinking in the dialogue portion of our webinar that you may hear from me and from some of the ideating that we had done prior to today is in that dream space. We want to also acknowledge, I want to also acknowledge that governance is complex. There are lots and lots of lenses in the kaleidoscope of how boards do their work, how they function, their size, their construction. The good news is that there's lots of room to think about what's possible. It also means that there may be some mental maps or some varied experiences, as Makiyah said earlier, that really bring us to the conclusions or the ways of thinking that we have today. And what's exciting to me about this conversation is that questions can disrupt constructs. And so there may be some constructs that we are bringing to this conversation that we're ready to shed or ready to interrogate or ready to look at through another lens. So we may not solve every single question that folks may have about governance structure from a standpoint of present day, but this dream space and this interrogation space is really part of the seedling of this conversation today. On the next slide, you'll see a list of board roles and functions, really. This is one articulation from what I consider to be somewhat of an evergreen article from NPQ. It's now been republished, I think, 3 times by my count, last count. And I wanted to just lift this up because this is what has been distilled into what the body of much of the prescriptive literature has said that boards do. That said, it's really important to understand again, the wide degree of variation that's there in the sector. And I'm here to give us some cornerstones, some tent posts around that before we really blow off some windows and doors and have a wider sweeping conversation. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, what I want to do is just share a quote about governance as you think about these functions that are up here on your screen. This is from also Nonprofit Quarterly, Frederick Anderson and Dave Renz. Boards and governance are related, but they are not synonymous. Governance is a function, while the board is a structure. By definition, boards must engage in governance, but most boards do other work, such as, for example, fundraising, which is not governance, end quote. And I did bungle the last part. So let me take another run at that. I love my mistakes. But most boards do other work too, parentheses, such as fundraising, which is not governance. I wanted to share that with you because some boards do fundraise, some boards don't, and a wide degree of variation takes place around specifically strategy and strategic planning. And so just to quote the most recent board source, Leading with Intent data, 78% of boards have some kind of formal strategic plan or framework that they use. And of those, 74.9% of boards do that in the construction of a full board, not as necessarily a subcommittee or some portion of the board. So just to give us, again, some things to hang our hat on in terms of not what should be, but what's reported as typical and what's happening now. If we look at the next slide, you can see another construction of the way to think about board functions, with some functions kind of nested up under that. As someone who thinks a lot about the ways to convey board roles very effectively to folks, I use slightly different terminology. Establish organizational identity is a way that I would talk about shaping the mission and the strategic direction. I wanted to put this up, both of these two slides up, on purpose, because it underscores that we bring many different mental maps to the work of boards. That can be very helpful when board members bring good habits from one board to the next. It can also be less than helpful when we are bringing some mental maps that are either not the right fit for the organization of the board for which we serve, or if they are articulated in such a way where they're implicit but not explicit, and we're talking at cross purposes. And so that's the point. I want to explore the mental maps behind the way we do governance. And what Makiyah and I were looking at together was really some of the social movement elements that offer us some inspiration. So if you want to think about the dynamic conversation on the next slide that we had around what really inspires us, it's the people. I will share that the things that the board does around strategy and accountability and ethical direction really have to do with the ethos by which decision making happens. And so let me just turn to the next slide and really give us some grounding in the selected elements of social movements from Pasteur. These are condensed selected elements of 10 elements of social movements that you can see here, layered up against the principles of purpose-driven boards, most recently published in Stanford Social Innovation Review by Ann Walstead, former CEO of BoardSource. And what is intriguing and appealing to really think about here is that, as Makiyah mentioned earlier, we want to understand how connected boards are to the work that they are doing. So while on the one hand, we have a lot of diversity in how boards are doing the work that they do, and there's a great deal of runway in terms of how boards are constructed, the question becomes, how are boards connected to the communities that they serve? So to give you a little bit of context about what you see in terms of the purposes of, the principles of purpose-driven boards, I want to focus in on authorized voice and power. And one of the things that drives this principle is that half of all chief executives said they did not have the right board members to establish trust with the communities that they serve. And only a third of boards placed a high priority on the knowledge of the community served. And that raises some questions for how the board does its work. No matter what work the board is doing, how informed is the board about the operating environment in which it does its work, about its partnership in order to achieve mission. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide and raise the question of who. Who is it that the board members are, and what is the perspective and the expertise that they bring? And how the board prioritizes and decides for the organization. To me, in many ways, this is one of the most interesting elements of the Stanford Social Innovation Review article, because what it does is it establishes the dynamic interplay between what the board understands its role to be, how it's peopled, and how it does its work. And so again, against that backdrop of a great deal of variability, I want to share with you that there's a chance for us to dream. There's a chance for us to have a bigger conversation today. And I'm excited to have that conversation, to think about how we conceive of notions of power and partnership and what that means for who board members are and how they serve in the boardroom. And so with that in mind, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Makiyah to introduce Dr. Rojas, Carmen, to learn from her work and these ideas together.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenifer. I'm getting more into my somatics, and I am feeling the energy because I am overjoyed that Carmen Rojas is here with us, given her leadership at the Marguerite Casey Foundation and her general, she is a visionary, and you are a visionary and a dreamer. And so I'm excited for you to share a little bit about MCF as well as your journey before we get into some of the dialogue related to boards and social movements, and if there's any interconnection there.
Yeah. So first and foremost, thank you so much to Nonprofit Quarterly for the invitation, to you, Makiyah, and you, Jenifer, for creating space for the conversations that led to this moment, as well as for grappling with a set of really important questions about how our sector is thinking about building durable institutions to confront the challenges our communities are facing. I'm really so happy to be here. Marguerite Casey Foundation supports leaders, initiatives, and scholars that are really focused on shifting the balance of power in society to those folks who've long been excluded from having it. Our work is really about moving meaningful resources to folks on the front lines of the most important fights, not only in their communities, but I think in our country at this moment. And that looks a whole bunch of ways. Makiyah is an amazing advocate and shouter-outer of our book club, Reading for a Liberated Future, where we amazing, where we take the time to read, frankly, and engage with people who have spent most of their careers exploring the set of ideas, issues, places that are central to animating a fight for a more just future. To our Freedom Scholars program, where we support a set of scholars in the form of a $250,000 award in recognition of the ways that they have both been able to articulate and share a set of ideas about racial and economic justice, but to marry those ideas with movement. And I was just saying to Makiyah, we're so excited that in the next little bit, we'll be able to announce our next round of Freedom Scholars. At our core, we are a foundation, so very technically, we're almost $1 billion in assets, and have been working really diligently as an institution from our board through our staff to make sure that we have a clarity of purpose and alignment to be in service of and to our grant recipients. And so that has been a really interesting and not an easy journey. It has been a fraught journey. I come to this work after building an organization called the Workers Lab, where we were really singularly focused on making sure that the promises that were made to working people in the 20th century of a minimum wage, that work actually created room for you to have and be self-realized in the world, to make those promises, to deliver on those promises for all working people. And it was an amazing opportunity for the first time for me to build a board from scratch, which was an amazing gift. I'm on the board of a number of organizations, including Children's Defense Fund, and recently termed out, of my board service at General Service Foundation. And so have a multitude of perspectives of my role as a board member, our board as the leader of an institution, and I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you so much. So we're going to get into some questions. Jenifer, do you have one?
I am ready, and it's just so perfectly served up, Carmen, knowing the different experiences that you just shared. How do you think about the role of boards in general and of your board specifically, if there is any distinction between the two?
Yeah. We are a foundation, so I'll just say like these are unique to, I think, philanthropic organizations. So I have 4 very basic things that I think a board is responsible for: approving grants, approving budget, evaluating and managing the work of a CEO, and approving and contributing to a strategic plan or direction for the organization. And I've been really lucky in that when I started this role, there was just an opening at the foundation to bring on a set of board members. And it was a really fascinating conversation because I think, especially for philanthropic institutions, there's a sense that you can't both be proximate and an expert, that there's like a trade-off, right? You can only have a person of color, but they can't have a finance background. You can only, like, there's like these weird zero-sum assumptions. And I think that those assumptions lead to the both racial as well as ideological makeup of the set of philanthropic boards that we have across our sector today. The one difference that I would make is instead of approving grants, I think a nonprofit board should raise money. I think it should help the executive raise money. I think that that's just like an important piece of work. And I'm really worried, as are a number of people that are sort of best and brightest leaders in this moment, are spending an inordinate amount of time responding to boards and raising money, but not having the spaciousness to actually do the dreaming that we need to do to have a more just future. And so I would add that as a caveat for the nonprofit board. I'll say for our current board, it's been an interesting time, right? So I started in June of 2020 and COVID happened. We had a set of board members retire and went through a pretty rigorous process to identify people who sat at the intersection, right? So people who both understood taxes, audits, financials, as well as had demonstrated a commitment to racial and economic justice. And found, I think, what I think, well, I'm just like the best board and for all intents and purposes. My relationship with the board, I feel like should always be a little tight, right? Like, I don't think that it should be a seamless or like flexible relationship, right? Where like I'm setting an agenda that they are following. I believe in questions creating space, and I think that the best thing that I get from my board is the set of questions that they ask me, not only about our grant making, not only about our strategy, but about the well-being and health of our organization, about places where I would have tried to do something different. As I reflect on the last 2 years in this role, of course, their mistakes were made. And what I've loved about my relationship with the board is that those mistakes aren't taken for granted, and that there's always an opportunity to learn. So Rashad at one of our board meetings was like invited me to have like a longer conversation about unforced errors. So over the last 2 years, what are some decisions that I made that were unforced errors that like I can't point to somebody else, I can't point to something else, that were of my making? And it was 2 things. And this is where that tightness is. It was scary, right? Like it's scary to tell your bosses that you made a mistake on your own. And it was wholly liberating because I felt like we could then have the very honest and necessary conversation about how we move forward as an organization. And I think that there's a way in this moment where different kinds of foundation boards, different types of organizational boards, are so subsumed in strategy and in trying to do the programmatic work that they actually aren't able to hold leaders accountable or to engage in the difficult conversations that need to happen in order for organizations to not only be durable, but to survive what is likely to be a hard upcoming moment for us.
Awesome. So you mentioned kind of the opportunity when you took the helm of Marguerite Casey Foundation for some of the board seats to be replenished because there were some transitions. And Jenifer and I have talked a lot about how like who's at the board table matters. Obviously, there's so much that people are bringing when they, make decisions on behalf of the organization based on past experiences, kind of their expertise, etc. And I think that some board members stay around too long and that term limits should be a thing that are embraced. And maybe, as Jenifer and I were dreaming, we talked about one perhaps antidote to some of this might be mass resignations or shrinking to a minimum compliant size and then starting to rebuild, or even having like the opportunity for like an open call for nominations, not just the self-perpetuating process that a lot of boards go through. Yeah. And so I think this question around the composition of your board or other board experiences, I'm curious about, you mentioned a rigorous process. I'm curious about how you thought about actually resourcing and ushering in the new, I guess, crop of board members that you need for this next leg of the journey that MCF is on.
Yeah, I thought about these 4 things. I thought about and had amazing conversations with the set of board members that remained about who in the country was going to help me and the rest of the board understand the financial commitments that we were making as an institution, both from and as an investor, because the vast majority of foundations are actually do more investing than grant making, just on numbers. Based on the math. And the 2 people who I thought were not only smartest and had a track record of doing this work, but also demonstrated a commitment to racial and economic justice were Alice and Ian. Like they just were at the forefront of their fields. In terms of grant making, I wanted people who, we made a decision when I started that we were no longer going to fund national organizations, that we were going to take a break from funding national organizations. And it created like a knowledge gap for us where we didn't have proximity to national leaders. And so I wanted that proximity. I felt like having a national view on the set of issues confronting the communities in which we do grant making is critical for our work. It would allow us to create a radical tapestry of change, right? And so Janine, Rashad, Marisa, in many ways, Stacy are emblematic of people with a national perspective who have positions of how change happens in the communities where we do grant making. People who are willing to evaluate and manage me. So like a number of these people were board members of mine at Workers Lab, and I knew that they could hold the tension, right? So in that same way, I think I mentioned this conversation, this board conversation with Rashad, but Zeke, who's also the president of a foundation in Spokane, Washington, not in Seattle, Washington, is contending with a set of really critical issues around leadership in this moment and what it means to lead a philanthropic institution, and to have Zeke and frankly, reflect back to me a type of leadership that was spacious, abundant, and effective was really important to me. And so process-wise, we had an external person come in, everybody had to submit a letter of interest, a resume. There were certain people, we had a pretty broad first round of people, and then did interviews with the current board. And Rami Nashashibi, who's my governance chair, and leads an amazing group in Chicago named Iman, at every one of the governance committee meetings where people were interviewed, you could just see how they were building a web with each other. Our past board members and our now current board members, they were just like jibing off of each other and asking really important questions that I think are critical for a board to ask, especially a philanthropic board. Like, what is our role in this moment as an institution? They were holding the space of, frankly, the shit show of 2020, and sort of saying that in that moment, their role may be more like, we all need to move together, because we didn't know what was going to happen. Remember the first days of the pandemic, we didn't know if it was going to be like a one-day pandemic or a 1 year pandemic. And so I felt like there were a set of these tensions there. And so we had that pretty rigorous process. Folks were interviewed, they came on, and then recently had two new board members join, Megan Ming Francis from University of Washington and former HUD Secretary Julian Castro. Again, similarly, who in the country is best situated to help advise me to lead this direction in this moment, lead this organization in this moment, sorry.
So Carmen, I'm really fascinated by your reflection on how important it was to have that conversation about unforced errors, and that it's a scary conversation. And so I'm just curious if there's anything you could speak to for CEOs that are out there. We know they're with us on the webinar today, around maybe not only proximity and skill, but anything that you might speak about in terms of leadership, social and emotional skills, enter into that any way you want, but some of those intangibles that are sometimes hard to capture in a recruitment process.
Had so many. Slow down. I mean, I just think that this is a long, Makiyah knows I love a book. So Freedom is a Constant Struggle is one of my favorite books of all time. And it's a constant reminder that even when we win a policy, we elect a person, we house a family, even when we have a victory, the fight continues, right? And I felt the fierce urgency of the moment, and really wish I would have taken more time to breathe and assess, Jenifer. I confused identity and ideology. And so I think there's a really tough question in our sector right now, where this conversation about proximity presumes that there's a depth of alignment and commitment to service. And I just have so much evidence that it's not true. And want to make sure that we as an institution, one of the conversations I feel like keep coming back to, both at the board and at the staff level, is about what is our role as a foundation, and it's to give out money. We're not a movement organization. We don't organize people. We don't identify as such. We have one principal job, which is to get the most money possible to folks on the front lines of the most urgent fights in our country right now. And I think that there's a confusion about that, especially you work at a big institution with a lot of money. I think the story that we're telling ourselves right now is a bit mixed about what the role of specifically philanthropic institutions is in this moment. I'm like still thinking about this thing you said in your presentation, Jenifer, the 75% of people who don't feel like their board members are the right board members for them. And that feels for me like a governance crisis. And I think the place, I'll say in philanthropy, that we see it more than in any other place is in family philanthropy. That in family foundations, you have family members who are using philanthropic institutions to heal family harms, to fund pet projects. And at a moment where there are a whole sort of cadre of amazing women of color leaders entering into these positions, these boards, their lack of clarity of their functional role is atrophying a really critical muscle for leaders in this moment, for women of color leaders in particular in this moment. Yeah, is that helpful, Jenifer?
It is, and I'm moved, and wanted to share something that resonates for me, Carmen. Really just honoring words from Adrienne Maree Brown, because once I find my own, I'll say it a different way. But there are so many truths that can be said so many ways. And this one matters so much to me, which is that there is work that each of us must do in ourselves in order to make something more possible for the collective. And we will not be able to claim something for the collective that we haven't been in the practice of claiming for ourselves, which is what your observations make me think about.
Yeah, I do. You know, I'm noting like the difference between running a foundation and running a nonprofit. Having come from running a nonprofit, I was not prepared for the distortion of money and what it does to people, and about the moment, to be honest with you, Jenifer, like, I've been for the last 2 years and a bit convening a group of CEOs, and we're like 40 now. And it's been fascinating to hear the challenges that leaders are confronting in this moment, that women of color leaders are confronting, that are frankly, that non-women of color leaders who are part of this group can't even, are like, what are you talking about? That's, you're talking, a great example is like power sharing, right? Like the norm of power sharing within institutions. And it's fascinating to me that when women of color leaders take the helm of institutions, that's when there's a pressure to share power. And there's a sense that we don't have the expertise, skill, knowledge to actually lead by example. I think that there's this really hard conversation right now, and this is why I love that we're having this conversation about boards around hierarchy, and a sense that inherent in hierarchy is that inherently hierarchies are bad. And there are tons of examples of positive hierarchy, tons, infinite. We don't, for me, the Freedom Scholars and this book project is an invitation for us to actually learn about these examples and not write things away because they are uncomfortable and they decenter us from a position of power. And so I am both, I'm going to do a little turn. Like, I'm deeply optimistic for us. I'll just speak at Marguerite Casey Foundation, philanthropy, our sector. Inappropriate, but you know, our conversation last week, the three of us had a conversation last week where it was like a tension, it was tight. And it was so beautiful to end the call with a depth of respect for the work that you two are doing, and for such gratitude to you two for letting me disagree and not feeling like I was personally attacking you or that I was now your enemy. And I think the more that we practice that, the greater our muscle is going to be at that. And I think that is the board. That's the job of the board, right? Like, again, it should be tight. It should be tight. Yeah.
So in the spirit of tightness, you said that your foundation's job is to give away money. It's not to organize. And I've been playing with words, and I'm also not a student of Latin social movements like you are. So I'm also realizing, like, the way I think about movements might be like 101 compared to like a depth and kind of like the richness that you might bring from, you know, study.
Yeah.
But I've been toying with kind of like a paradigm shift from the board, and this kind of touches on your hierarchy point. The board is an overseer to like the board is an organizer. And by organizer, I think I'm still working through my ideas, but I think I mean that there's proximity to the people. There's an understanding about the authorized voice and power that Jenifer mentioned earlier. that there's really kind of like a deep respect and prioritization of like what the people that are the subject of the mission statement need from the organization and for why it exists. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like the vernacular might not be exactly accurate, but you also lifted up power and some of the tensions with power. I think I'd love to hear from you, like where you see, if you see the interface between your board that is, you know, approving the budget, approving the grants, setting strategy, evaluating you, and the actual like movements that you're resourcing, because you're moving tons of money to actually like affect real change in communities. And I'm just wondering if those intersect at all, or if you see them as kind of like stay in your lane, you're playing this position. You're playing that position.
No. There's a lot of bearing witness. The way that I would describe the relationship between our board and our grant recipients, like remove the institution, is bearing witness. So we, once a quarter, go to a place where we have a number of grant recipients. Grant recipients come and share their work with our board, but mostly are in conversation with our board about the context in which they're doing their work, about challenges and opportunities that they see, about opportunities to practice. We just had this really fantastic board meeting in Georgia where Marisa Franco, who runs Mi Gente's on our board, was with the executive director of GLAR, and they were just like in the tension of what it meant to be Latina organizers in this moment. Two people bearing witness and in relationship with each other, who knew each other, right? Like, I would say another practice of ours that I just truly love is that we invite Freedom Scholars to sit in. We have a program called the Freedom Scholars where we support radical scholars on the left, which is an award. And they get $250,000, and really it's like, here's your award, see you later, alligator. And one of the things that we invite them to do, should they choose to, is to come and sit in on our board meeting and sit from beginning to end, and then act as essentially discussants, reflecting back to board and grant recipients and anybody in the room what they heard, places where they think we can be doing better, opportunities to shift our language in a meaningful way, critique of each other. The first one that we had, I'll just never forget, Kinga Yamada Taylor and Kathy Cohen, just like they did this thing that I just really love. We're talking about electoral politics, and they just have different perspectives on the role of organizing people to vote. Like this overwhelming amount of resources goes to these efforts, and time bound, and what does that mean in a moment and context in which our democracy is dying? And they disagreed with each other, and at the end of every disagreement, Kathy would look at Kienga and say, "But I love you." And then Kienga would be like, "This is my opinion, and I really just respect you so much." And there was like a tenderness to the tension that I feel like for our board to watch was powerful. For our grant recipients in the room to watch was really powerful. And so the way that I think about that proximity, Makiyah, is the bearing witness that I think foundations are especially the center to left foundations are in a weird moment, in which we are describing ourselves as movement organizations and avoiding the fact that we have disproportionate power, disproportionate access, disproportionate institutional luxuries, the amount of money that people get paid, the benefits that they have, the security that they have in their jobs is different from when I was at Workers Lab, and just like fundamentally different. And when we name these institutions same as nonprofit organizations that have to raise money, I think we do a disservice to the hardness of that work. I think we're partners. I I think we bear witness, but I worry that it obfuscates the truth, which is uncomfortable, I think, for a number of us to be like, yeah, we make a lot of money. Yeah, I'm so job secure. This is amazing. Like my job provides all these things. Yeah, like I think it creates that's uncomfortable. I think for a number of people with a set of politics that are more progressive.
I know Jenifer has a question, but what you just said makes me think of all of the annual reports that I see from foundations, where it's almost like a taking credit for or saying like, look at the good work we did, when actually like the sweat, the tear, like all of the like real labor, I guess, if you will, is being done by someone else. And so your point about obfuscation, I think, yeah, it's resonating for me.
I love that. I love that you brought that up. I mean, I have a fraught relationship with that. Like there is no, we're losing. Our people are about to be dying en masse in this country. And I think it's absurd that philanthropy spends money on any annual. It doesn't make sense. It's our job to move money and to do so with the least amount of constraint to the leaders and organizations that, as you mentioned, right, like most clearly reflect to, relate to, can be in conversation with our organizational missions and charitable purpose. And we miss the point in that. I think we sometimes miss the point in that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Similar to the way Makiyah started the last question around overseer to organizer, and that shift is this invitation to potentially retire this just volunteers mantra that is rampant. So if we were to circle back to the purpose-driven board leadership frame with that emphasis on who board members are and the perspective and the expertise that they bring and what they understand their role to be, what do you think about the just volunteers frame? Is it a booby trap? Is there something to replace it? How would you answer that?
I think it's different for different institutions, right? Like, I'm gonna practice something that I might take back. I am 51% convinced of what I'm about to say, but I think just volunteers, it is a disservice to our sector. You like that? This is amazing about me, is that I'm like, I kind of believe this, and then I'm going to come out real hot and say something incendiary. I'm still playing this out, but I think that these are real jobs. I think overseeing a CEO of an organization is a real job. It's a job that you do, and that it's not. It's something that people should take seriously in that way. Governance is serious. Your point about the amount of time that people spend on boards, that they're the term limits, like bylaws as a governing set of rules are really important. And to think about board service as an act of charity as opposed to a form of labor, I think does a disservice both to leaders of organizations, but more importantly to the communities that organizations are built and exist to serve. I think that that's true. I think that's, I buy it. I buy my own thing. That's what it's like to live with me, Jenifer.
I love it.
So have you gone from 51% to like 91%?
I'm like 71%. I'm open to changing my mind should there be a different example. I think naming labor is important. Mm-hmm. This is the same reason, Makiyah, why I am uncomfortable with naming philanthropic organizations as movement organization, is that at the end of the day, they're employers. They were investors. What do we do the most of? We invest money. What do we do the second most of is employ people. What do we do the third most of, depending on the size of our budget, is give out money. And so I think that being able to just be, it's not sexy. Of course, I want to be like, yeah, we're a movement organ, of course, but it doesn't feel honest to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. You can't see the wheels in my head happening, but as I think about all of the kind of ideas that Jenifer and I were grappling with and like kicking around, you make a compelling case for me as it relates to like the labor and the work that goes into it, and how, there is a danger in co-opting, similar to like the corporate sector. There's so many things that are defaults because it works at Exxon, where they think that it should work at your local food shop, your local housing shelter. And it's like, these are not the same. And so I'm processing. I have one more question for you before we open it up for kind of like the broader Q&A that Jean is going to help moderate for us. So I've been thinking quite a bit about like white supremacy culture and the characteristics and the water that we swim in, and how much of those kind of default ways of thinking permeate all of like the systems, the structures, the paradigms that are present in organizations, in boardrooms, et cetera. And so whether it's, either or thinking or only one right way, or like the hierarchy piece where it's like one person is the shot caller without any input from others, et cetera. I guess I'm just wondering, with everything that we've talked about thus far and like the possibility for boards, a few moments ago, you said that you're like optimistic. And so I'm curious about like, when you think about some of the mental models that are handcuffs for our sector, what is it that you see as new possibilities? Like, what new dreams do you have for boards and for some of the folks that have joined us today?
Written down clarity of purpose. I think every board member should have a job description. These are like the most technocratic dreams, but I do think I want to like do an asterisk to the white supremacy culture thing, because I want to come back to that. But I think shared understanding of role, purpose, both organizational and charitable purpose, in written form is important. I think that when it's loose, it creates a ton of room, frankly, for exploitation. And that lack of understanding often becomes, my best friend always hates it when people disagree with her, and she says, and they say, I'm confused. Like people are like, who don't like conflict are like, I'm so confused. And she's like, no, you don't, you just disagree, and it's okay. And when there aren't written rules and norms and shared understanding, everything is confusion and nobody can actually enter into principled disagreement. And I think that is a real failure right now in our sector. And I worry, this is my loop around to the white supremacy culture, that we have laid white supremacy culture at the feet of individuals, taking our eyes off the systems and structures that maintain white supremacy every day. So we're like showing up. I was recently at a meeting where somebody was like, showing up on time is white supremacy culture. And I was like, really? I don't know. I just like to show up on time. I'm just gonna say maybe, but that just seems like not the problem and not the fight that I want to be in. And I worry, I don't know if you all have seen the response, but the authors of like the original framework of white supremacy culture and organizations have written a response for how that document has been weaponized and used to shift a focus away from people with actual material power setting the norms and conditions for how we live our lives in this country, to executive directors of organizations, who have 5 people staff. All of a sudden, they're the KKK. And I'm like, really? I just want to say that it's that in this moment, again, the hope and dream that I have is that we can have greater shared understanding and discipline about the set of issues that are actually confronting our communities. Not just like me and my own individual well-being, but us, all of us, the majority of us. And I'm a little bit, my wheels are now turning, Makiyah, and I'm so excited to get into another conversation with you about this, because I think it's a really important and hard and messy conversation that we have to have, especially going into next year.
Yeah,
I'm getting myself to the end of this year. You guys don't know this, but my birthday is on Friday, next Friday. Is it next Friday? Next Thursday. And the last couple of birthdays have been a real shitter. This COVID is really, I'm a Leo through and through, and it's really done a number on me. And I've made a decision that this will be the year where I fully stretch into the messiness of being a human being and do that as publicly as possible, so that it acts as an invitation or a clarion call, or like a light. I just read this amazing book on lighthouses, a lighthouse to all of us who believe in racial justice, who are committed to making sure that working people have better lives in this country, that this is going to be a messy process. And we as human beings are imperfect and messy in this process.
Makiyah, can I get in here for a second?
Yeah, and then Jean, you're up.
As a fellow Leo, Carmen, happy birthday.
Thanks, Maddie.
May it be a marvelous, marvelous year ahead. I just want to get in here on time for a second. I'm so glad it came up, because I love the deep and rigorous inquiry of how certain norms can be reflected upon, and without taking away from what you shared about being on time, time can still be weaponized. And I experience governing activities to be a somewhat time-starved activity, which is why I love what you said earlier about, let's call it the job that it actually is. And for me personally, I'd far rather go to a 3-hour board meeting where we talk about items of substance than a 2-hour board meeting that started and ended on time where we didn't talk about anything of substance. So I just love that came up.
Thank you. Happy birthday to you.
Thanks.
It looks like we have a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, unsurprisingly. And just to give you all a breath, I'm just going to reflect a couple themes and then I'll pose some specific questions. The first thing I wanted to reflect, Carmen, is how resonant your description was of how women of color leaders are being set up in this moment, including the coincidence of this desire to strip away hierarchy, right when women of color are stepping into hierarchy. And so I know this is something that NPQ has been tracking closely. I know our editor-in-chief, Cindy Suarez, is writing about it and thinking about it, but it's absolutely a pattern that we're seeing. And it's something that I think bringing it into the board space is important, right? For board members to recognize what women of color executives are being asked to manage, to both lead a hierarchy and be very suspect of it, to embody leadership, but to tear it down, right? These are almost impossible messages. And so just want to, while I'm giving you a breath, let you know that was upvoted numerous times while you were speaking, and thank you for speaking to it so clearly. Most of the people in the webinar are, as you mentioned, running nonprofits and are translating some of the practices and mindsets that you're sharing from the Marguerite Casey Foundation into their own context and the context that you've worked in many times as well. So I'm going to bring us to that space a little bit with some of these questions to meet folks where their questions are. And you've mentioned a number of practices that are very specific, and I didn't interpret as necessarily unique to a well-resourced foundation. For instance, your process of recruitment. Obviously, you have a pretty compelling board to serve on, and now that you've added the people you've added, I'm sure recruitment gets easier and easier in terms of people taking the call, right? But nonetheless, this idea of first who is around the table and putting in a system of recruitment, can you just speak a little bit more to the execution of that practice and what you've learned by making it something that people applied to?
Mm-hmm. What did I learn? Oh, well, I'll actually use my workers lab example, which is a nonprofit organization. In building that board, I was clear that for me and my leadership, the things that I needed to do to be able to have as much space to dream were people, again, who could help me raise money, who could help me set a budget, who could evaluate me and be in this tension with me, and that could improve and contribute to our strategic direction. And so it was a pretty, it's not only a racially diverse board, it was like a practically diverse board. And it was really the process of extending an invitation and having people do some work, frankly. Like, I don't think it's like imagine asking Stacey Abrams to apply to be on your board.
I can't.
And we had a third party, so it wasn't even through the institution. We had an external third party who managed this whole process for the foundation, and similar for the nonprofit. I think bringing somebody from the outside in to manage a process like that is important, so you don't have friends or family stay on the boards. You know, you see in new organizations a common thing, which is like, I just needed somebody to be on the board, so I had my sister join. Like, that is a common thing, and there's no deadline for that, and that's actually at the detriment that's the detriment of the ideas and leadership that folks are trying to exercise out in the world. And so I think written process is important.
Yeah.
And documented process is important. I think bringing somebody in, if you can afford it, from the outside to support you in that is important. I didn't want to get caught in a trap of like, I'm like a constant learner and believe. It's so funny, Makiyah. We're gonna make it. I believe in the gift of beginning again. And I think that there is a thing in the process of creating a board, inviting people into a board where you can take it seriously because you take your work seriously and you take your leadership seriously. And I think that that's true for foundations. It's true for nonprofits. We had some really hard conversations with my board at Workers Lab all the time, and with each other. It's tight, and I think process is important. Sorry, I'm now waxing poetic, but process,
no, it's very helpful.
Process and external support, I think, are like the most important things.
And I can very much imagine if people are resonating with this, that there's a way to do that outside support that isn't a high-powered search firm. I mean,
absolutely
listening for the underneath premise of it, of taking our leadership seriously, taking the opportunity seriously, taking the labor seriously. It could be a former board member who has some time, right? You know,
that's right.
Organizing the process is what I'm taking away with some seriousness. Another question that has come up is, and I love that I take it that the word tight has a lot of elements for you when we say it's tight, but what happens in your experience what is the staff relationship to the board, if any, around that tightness? And what happens there when someone has such an effective relationship as it sounds like you do with your board? Where is the staff in that?
So we have I'm going to answer these. I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to answer the question in three ways. Great. Tight, where I grew up in the Bay Area, meant like really cool. That's tight. Or it meant like the physical description of tightness or tension. So I'm using it in you're exactly right. Spot on. So we functionally have staff that staffs the board. So we have an amazing board liaison and Wendy Cox. We have a board secretary who is my chief of staff, Ziva Kalali. We have just like a brilliant events coordinator who is Michael Flores. So there is engagement, like pretty constant engagement. In terms of reporting roles to the board, it's me and Dan Gould, who's our VP of Finance and Investment. And essentially we staff, I participate in every committee of the board, as do Wendy and Ziba. And then Dan and I participate, and he primarily staffs the Finance and Investment and Audit Committee. And yeah, he's my number two person at the board, with the board. There are a couple of ways. So there's like the administrative support, staffing. I believe in accountability. So we have a whistleblower. We use a whistleblower that goes directly to the board. We have you've got a way to complain about me, about anybody really at the organization, internally and externally, and that goes directly to the board. And that can happen from the staff level. It can happen from a grant recipient. Frankly, I can say something here and you can be like, I really didn't like Carmen said that. You can file a report, it gets investigated. But I feel like that is another way that staff engages with the board. I believe in like a clear line, right? So like I actively ask my board for advice when I need it on organizational growth, on management, on structure, especially as we are in this moment of the pandemic, where I feel like I have a bit more oxygen, leaning on people who have built organization to give me insight on building organization is the best thing I can do. I don't think that that's necessary. And the board is always clear. Again, I'll say the Rami Melody, my board chair, who's just excellent. They're just so clear about the bright line between my job as the manager of the organization and of the staff in the organization and their job as my manager. And I have the room and space to ask for advice when I need it.
Thank you so much. I want to give Makiyah and Jenifer a chance also to speak to some of the themes they've been lifting up in this conversation and that you've been reflecting on, Carmen. One of the themes or the tensions, and I will never forget tenderness to the tension. Thank you for that, Carmen. This tension between, is it overseer and organizer, overseer or organizer? And you said, Makiyah, that your ideas are still in formation, of course, and Jenifer, you talked about looking 10, 12 years out, but I just want to invite you, because I know it's something that you're working on a lot, based on what you've heard even in this conversation. How are you thinking about the metaphors of overseer, organizer, and what's possible? I'll start with Makiyah.
Okay, thank you. For me, I'm reflecting on an exchange I had with Dorian Warren, who is the president of Community Change, where he lifted up some of the kind of proximate work that his board members do related to their campaigns and some of the electoral organizing, et cetera. And so it was in the frame of like overseer versus organizer. He was like, yeah, this could apply based on our context. And so I think it's an example of maybe the variety and nuance, or like context matters. What Dorian needs from his board is like different from what Marguerite Casey Foundation's board is doing. And so I think for me, I'm holding the variety and turning to wonder about like what's in the in-between, where's the liminal space. And given that organizing can be, I think like perhaps loaded or like there's like a specific meaning, like there's certain ways to do community organizing. If I think of Saul Alinsky, like I'm not thinking that boards should be using Saul Alinsky's playbook. And so I can see how some of the language can be problematic, which is why I'm appreciative of Carmen kind of lifting up, like there's one job to do, et cetera, and being really specific and clear. For me, I still believe in the aspiration for more people-centered building power from the ground up, and think that board members do need to have some insight and perspective that really connects them to what is the what's the like emanating pulse of the people or the subjects of their mission statements that they are there on behalf of. I think my service as a college trustee was enhanced because I was an alum of the institution. I could speak to how significant scholarship aid was when we were having our budget conversations, and it's a pandemic and we need to cut somewhere. And it's like, yeah, I don't think you should cut because look how I turned out. And so I think that there's something about like the lived experience and being able to dial in where you have specific insight and wisdom based on your proximity and experience. And I can also see where it can be a slippery slope to try to like layer on, I guess, approaches or ways of being that work in one context, but not the other. So I think that's what I'm untangling in my head is if there's something else in the liminal space, and maybe overseer and organizer aren't the two polarities there.
Thank you. Jenifer, invite you in on that.
Absolutely, and this may be more of a response to some of the rich reflections Makiyah offered up than the question itself. But in my evolving thinking, we wanted to draw upon the ethos of social movements. So I love the fact that metaphor has been sort of named. And what I love about the ethos, again, of social movements is a sense of urgency, a sense of clarity of values that perhaps in a board setting can sometimes be eclipsed by the fiduciary oversights roles. And so that urgency, that love, that sense of central value that's animating, that encourages folks to see the work on the long haul, on the long field that it's going to take to achieve things. That rebalancing is really what's appealing for me. And then inside of that, it's this piece of self, which I sort of touched on earlier. And the fact is, present day, most of the folks serving on boards are people that look like me, who may or may not be proximate to the missions for which they serve. And so the questions then become, to Makiyah's very excellent points around what are the insights, the lived experiences, the mental maps that are then brought to that board service. And I think one of the gifts of our conversation today that I'll be taking with me, Carmen, is your very, very pithy insight around not confusing identity with ideology.
Thank you for that. And that stat, Carmen brought it up again, and I want to ask you to reference it again, and we'll include it in the follow-up recording. As I see in the question, people are asking for books you've mentioned and stuff, Carmen. So don't worry, everybody. Any book or resource that was mentioned here will be in the follow-up link. But Jenifer, in the intent, is it the intent to lead data that you got the 50% of executives said that they don't have the board members they need to be credible to their constituencies?
Yep, I'll read it exactly. Half,
okay.
49% of all chief executives said that they did not have the right board members to establish trust with the communities they serve.
Right. Okay. And so so that stat is, really stood out to all of us, and kudos to whoever asked that question, because I think it's difficult to get that data when we talk about boards. So somebody asked that question properly to get that answer. And I think it speaks a lot to their recruitment work and the clarity of purpose and not being too loose, being tight about what the assignment is, as Carmen has been saying. And is the deliverable credibility, and that can look a lot of ways, direct lived experience, student of the work, whatever it is, but there has to be some specificity, does there not? And I'll go to you, Carmen, on this, on what is credible to serve on the Marguerite Casey board that's focused on racial and economic justice? When you get all those applications, what smacks of credibility and what doesn't? How do you enforce that?
I think for me, it's an ideological commitment. I'm a person of the left. I believe in mass liberation. I believe in collective well-being over individual luxury. I believe in mass-based social movements. I believe in direct action. And I wanted to create a context where I had a group of people who had very different jobs in mind, frankly, who, and frankly, sometimes disagree with me, right? Like, what's a great example? Our work on Answer the Uprising to defund the police. It's uncomfortable for a number of our board members.
Sure.
It's not comfortable. And I don't think it should, I don't think that I was not looking for agreement. I was looking for aperture. Like I
Nice.
wanted to know, like, what were the missteps? Could I practice in the defund space and then be like, oh, actually, now that we've been doing this for 2 years, the insight that I have leading this organization in partnership with Jonathan Oster, who's our director of philanthropic initiatives, has been like, oh, we're doing this work on Answer the Uprising, focusing on defund the police. We're doing this work on ARPA. We've been treating them as two distinct bodies of work. The board, there's like conversation. There's not decision at the board about our program. There's conversation about that. And the insight was, these are two sides of the same coin. On the one side, our government finds money to police, imprison, and harm us. There's always money for that. But there's never money to house us. There's never money to school us. There's never money to feed us. There's never money to move us, right? Like that money doesn't exist. And I think that I wanted to have a board, again, that where alignment wasn't, strategic alignment was necessary, but personal alignment or ideological, they could see and witness. I didn't have to hide parts of myself in order for them to be on the board, and they were going to invite me to expand the aperture. I'll say, like, those are some of the most amazing conversations that we've had, are like those points of like, tight. It's tight.
Thank you.
Just like all of the examples are going through my mind right now.
I love it. I want to go to one more space because there's a lot of questions about meetings. People got very excited about having activists, organizers come to the meeting. There were some questions about the power dynamics of that, how you set that up, not to feel performative or et cetera. And I guess I would start the question, and we only have a few minutes here, but just how important are board meetings, the actual full group meeting, to you in your leadership and in your sense of the board's purpose? And are there any other practices or mindsets that you want to lift up about convening a board meeting?
I think meetings are important.
Mm-hmm.
I think that not because I'm a technocrat, but because I think documented practice and processes reduce the kind of risk and exposure that people who don't want leaders like me to exist, people who don't want organizations like us to exist, that's like the fastest way that they're going to get us, frankly, is if we don't have meeting minutes, if we don't have clear bylaws, if we're not standing in our C3 role when we're doing C3 stuff and C4 role when we're doing C4 stuff, And so I think meetings are important for that. And I think meetings for us have created room for relationship, right? Like to have Melody Barnes as my board chair, who was and continues to be like just a brilliant, amazing, not only scholar, but leader in the universe of federal policy, and Marisa Franco, who actively fought the Obama administration around immigration. That relationship is an important relationship, right? To have Janine Comano on our board and Zeke Smith, two amazing Native leaders who are in very different roles, forces other people on the board not to just imagine the fact that Native folks can only be running organizations and not foundations, that, to create greater texture to experiences, I think, that we conveniently put into boxes. So I think meetings are important for a whole host of reasons. They've been very important to me and my leadership because it's the place where I can be the most vulnerable. It's the place where I actively work through the hardness. I'm not a crier, and in the last couple of board meetings, I found myself just like overwhelmed both by like the sheer amount of space that was given to me to grapple and for them to bear witness for how I grapple and process organizational leadership and ask for advice. So I think that I'll just say, like, I think that they are great. The power imbalance with, it's so funny. We mentioned this board meeting in Georgia, and Rashad and Marisa afterwards pulled me aside and they were like, we need to just figure out a different format, because half the people on our board have been the people who come to present to boards. And so they were like, I feel like this, I get it. There's time constraints. We want to make sure that everybody has the right amount of time, and we want to make sure that, we create as much engagement as possible. But I think that was a gift. It was a gift. And then we went to the board and we're like, what's actually going to be helpful for you to learn? What is the relationship? And it was actually shorter presentation and more time to like sit down and eat with people.
Yeah, relationship.
It was like time to be with, and build relationship with one-on-one in a way that like a presentation will be helpful for edifying people on the issues and the place, but it's not going to be helpful. The power dynamics exist. And then at the end of the day, it was just like, oh yeah, the power dynamic exists. We pay people, we pay everybody all the money to do all the things. So like we try to figure out how to compensate people and to try to pretend like it's the power difference is not is going to go away because we did some sort of intervention, I think is just a lie. We have the most money, most power, most resources in the room. And I think naming that at the outset brings down the heat in the room.
Thank you for that. Well, I would love, without putting you on the spot, you can always pass, but I'd love to give you each a second to think in like 30 seconds or so, just an aspiration, going back to your first slide, Jenifer, looking out, 3, 5, 10 years, an aspiration for people who are serving on boards, for the role of boards in our larger work for social justice. So it could be something tactical and practical or something very futuristic, but what's something that comes to mind as an aspiration for boards down the road?
I'm going to go first because it's going to be the least inspirational. Clarity of job, clarity of role in relationship to the executive, to the staff, and to the organization.
Yeah, you're helping us see how that can be radical again, huh? Jenifer?
I'm going to go back to my touch point around self and collective, and that board members have a very clear sense of purpose around their own individual leadership as nested inside of what the board and the organization themselves are doing.
I love that. Makiyah.
I would, in the spirit of kind of relationship building, that there's explicit attention paid to how board members want to be in relationship with each other. So like actually naming and lifting up some of the intangibles. How are we going to hold conflict? How are we going to express our vulnerabilities, be clear when our feelings are hurt? Like, how are we going to like do the human thing and really lift up this spirit of Ubuntu, where we do have a shared humanity as we walk on earth together.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for all of the thinking that went into this session. Teaser that Makiyah and Jenifer are also putting pen to paper on some of these ideas. So look out for an article 2 to continue the conversation. We will include resources that were mentioned on this webinar in our follow-up email to you that will include the slides and the recording. We're going to take August off for a little bit of a break, and in September, we're going to welcome a panel of leaders who have gone virtual, who have brought their organizations out of the physical space into a virtual space, as we know so many of you are virtual or quasi-virtual, and explore what that means for management, for equity, et cetera. So we hope to see you all in September. Thanks, Dr. Rojas, Makiyah, and Jenifer for your time today.